The Conservative Party, they've had a lead for so long. How damaging has the whole Owen Paterson debacle been to them?
Well, we've seen a couple of polls over the past few days, one from my organisation Opinion and also one from YouGov, which shows the Conservative lead falling. So our latest poll shows the Conservative lead down to 1 point. It also shows Boris Johnson's approval rating falling to its lowest ever. So 20% more people now say they disapprove of the job the Prime Minister's doing than approve of the job he's doing. Now, with things like this, you can't always say that X causes Y. So we don't necessarily know that the row has caused the Conservative lead to drop. I think actually it's maybe just a little bit of things returning to normal after the budget and after conference season. And the Conservatives haven't actually been doing particularly well in the polls recently anyway, but I'm sure it hasn't helped. And I think if the story continues over the next week, possibly we'll start to see even some Labour leads in the polls, and that could in itself have a knock-on effect. We know that there's some Conservative MPs, for example, who are starting to get uneasy about the Prime Minister. So I'm not sure how big an effect it's had, but it comes at a time when the poll lead for the Conservatives is definitely falling.
Analysis really that this debacle last week was a storm in a teacup is potentially not accurate then.
Well, one thing we do know is that the public do view the Conservatives as corrupt, and definitely more corrupt than the Labour Party, but also more corrupt than they did back in April. So we asked some questions, do you think these different people and politicians are generally clean and honest or generally corrupt? And the numbers for both Prime Minister Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party are bad and getting worse. So the public do at least notice it. I don't think it's fair to call it a storm in a teacup. I'm still not convinced it's the main driver of how people will vote in an election, but it's definitely something that a lot of people have noticed.
The sense that this particular sleaze row has huge traction, that they have so underestimated how angry people are.
Well, I think the kind of sleaze rows that generally cut through are ones where people think that there's one rule for them and a completely different rule for politicians. And I think this is an example for that. They're the ones that really wind people up. We remember, for example, Barnard Castle last year when people got really wound up when they were closely following lockdown rules, and it was seen that the people at the top weren't. So they're the kind of sleaze rows that do have a real impact and do start to really upset people.
Chris, we've got this emergency debate. Boris Johnson's going to be, answering a lot of awkward questions about that U-turn by the government last week. Do the public actually pay attention to things like that? Could that sway things for Boris?
I mean, people don't really pay attention necessarily to the specifics. Let's be honest, nobody is going to be sitting in and watching the debate on the Parliament channel today or anywhere else. But really, it's about how many days a story ends up being in the news. So this is just a mechanism that's being used by the Labour Party to make sure that people are talking about this story again today and tomorrow. And I think the longer it goes on, the longer people are talking about it, the more damaging it's going to be for the Conservatives and the Prime Minister. I think the government was hoping that when they did the U-turn last week, when Owen Paterson resigned, the story would go away. That doesn't seem to be the case, firstly because this debate's happening today, but also because this seems to have been a moment when, yes, this story was something, but actually now people are trying to find lots of other stories to bolt onto it to keep the discussion on sleaze and corruption and cronyism going. So obviously we've got a new story coming out today talking about Labour asking the government to be investigated over different things, and also about looking into who's getting put in the House of Lords, things like that. So this story is going on longer and longer, and that's definitely not going to be a good thing for the Conservative Party.
I think you're probably wrong. I think a lot of people are going to be watching today's debate because, as I say, I think there is real anger out there. But I just want to move on, Chris, because COP26, it's more than halfway through now. Are we any further down the road as to understanding what on earth's going on there?
Well, when it comes to public opinion, I think it's fair to say that COP comes at a really, really interesting time. When I was looking back at some of our tracking data the other day, and if we go back, say, 3 or 4 years, fewer than 1 in 10 people said they thought that climate change and the environment was one of the biggest issues facing the country. When Theresa May was fighting the 2017 general election, more people cared about issues like housing, and it was very, very, very far down the list of things people cared about. when we look at it now, it's regularly a top 3, sometimes even a top 2 issue. Among young people, they say it's the most important issue facing the country, sometimes more important than the economy. We've seen a big shift over the past few years on the number of people who think that climate change is not just real, but it's not being exaggerated, and the government should be doing more for it. So it comes at a time when I think there is a lot of pressure, at least here in the UK, but also in other countries around the world, from the general population, from governments, to be doing a lot more. And I think that's one of the reasons we've seen this put by Boris Johnson. It's kind of one of the centre pieces of his administration, because public opinion has changed so massively on this issue over the past few years.
One of the battles, though, will be, and there's some polling on the front page of The Guardian today, which basically says citizens are alarmed by the climate crisis, but they either think they're already doing enough to preserve the planet, or they don't want to actually make any significant lifestyle changes. So do you think the public really do understand the issue?
So I think the big thing we're seeing at the moment in the polls is that, yes, people do think it's an issue, and they do think the government should generally be doing more, but they don't say they're willing to pay any more money financially, whether that be in tax or higher energy bills or higher petrol prices at the petrol pumps. They're not willing to pay any of those extra costs personally, in order to do things to help tackle climate change. And that's the government even needs to find ways of tackling climate change without costing people more money, or without people noticing that they're having to pay more money for it, which is a very, very difficult thing to do. Take the political hit. I'm still not sure this government is willing to do that, or convince people that they are going to need to take a financial hit in order to tackle this big issue. And at the moment, the numbers aren't showing that most people would support such measures.
Quick one about the Northern Ireland Protocol. If you're in Northern Ireland, you know all too well what the effect of this is. But what about the politics of this and the threat to invoke Article 16 that Simon Coveney over the weekend, the Irish Foreign Minister, was saying he understands the UK is about to do? Why are we here? What may happen next?
Yeah, so, I mean, the politics of this, I think, is pretty interesting, because I don't think it's a particularly good move for the government politically to be dragging out the Brexit battle over this sort of administration and into the next election. The reason the Conservatives managed to get such a significant majority in 2019 was not necessarily because they fought a big Brexit battle, but it's because where they were on one side and everyone else was on another side. But it was because they were seen as the party that could get Brexit done. And by that point, after all of the debates, after all of the arguments, after the drama in Parliament, people just wanted to move on from that issue. A lot of Remain voters, a lot of Leave voters just wanted to move on from that issue and focus on the other issues facing the country. If the debate now gets dragged back on and Brexit isn't seen to be done, despite the fact that that's the majority, that's the issue that the Conservatives won the last election on, I think that could be difficult for the Conservatives, and that could give Labour a lot of ammunition to come into a debate that's previously been very difficult for them. You said Brexit was done, it's not done, and it's not going well, is it, Prime Minister? I think it's a pretty powerful argument. So I don't think the politics of dragging this argument out does work for the government. I think ideally this is something that they should want to get fixed as soon as possible, whether that's on the Article 16 negotiations or anything else to do with Brexit.
Do you think people would wear a hard border being introduced between North and South?
I think sort of, unfortunately, and it's difficult to talk about, one of the things that we learned from the Brexit negotiations is that most people who don't live in Northern Ireland don't seem to mind too much what happens in Northern Ireland. We saw Theresa May's Brexit deal came back, everybody hated that. Boris Johnson sort of threw out a lot of the stuff to do with Northern Ireland, but people really weren't focusing on that. It wasn't one of their top issues for what should happen with Brexit. They cared about what should happen with immigration, what should happen with free trade, rather than necessarily the border in Northern Ireland, which was seen as distant and also something that they didn't particularly know enough about or understand.
Yeah, free trade, immigration and Northern Ireland. It's going well, isn't it?
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.